I'm just looking at the clock. I haven't been given the official go-ahead, but I think we should start making our way to the seats. Are we good to go online as well? Great. Maybe while people are getting settled, I'll actually start the session off with a story. Uncle Brett's story time. So this is a data research session, but we'll start with a story, and it's based on an image that probably a lot of you equity experts already know. I think I first saw it in a greenlining presentation. And the story goes something like this. Father, mother, and child wish to see and enjoy a baseball game from the outfield by looking over the fence. Now, if we have some resources to help make this happen, perhaps we could build some boxes to give them a great view so they can enjoy the game. Now, if we use equality as our guiding principle, we might choose to build 3 identical boxes, 1 for each of them. If we choose equity as our guiding principle, perhaps we'll spend more resources designing and building a rather large box for child so that she can see and enjoy the game, maybe a medium box for mother so they can see and enjoy the game, and maybe not spend the resources building a box for father who can already see and enjoy the game. Great. So that's a simple story. I don't need to pull out my San Diego Padres hat here in LA territory. I am a big Ohtani fan. But the point is bringing that framework, that equity mindset to evaluation is going to be a lot about what we're talking about today. So today is a data research. This session is a data research session. Real quick show of hands. How many of you would consider yourself data people or data savvy or data users? Okay. I'm going to say half, maybe more. Probably because you're here, you are. But how many would you consider yourselves storytellers? And how many of you keep both hands up if you think you're a little bit of both? And today we're really going to try to bring those two things together because data evaluation, in contrast to research, which may be more about discovery, is really about the specific context of a program and what brings that program meaning. So it really is about storytelling and constructing meaning and narratives from data. And also good stories are based on data as well, so vice versa. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to officially, now that we're settled in, welcome you to this session called Assessing Progress Toward Equitable Access to EVs with Incentive Program Metrics. And like bank robbers that steal from banks because that's where the money is, we're going to be stealing lessons learned from 2 statewide electric vehicle rebate programs in California and New York principally, because that's where the data is. But the challenge is for me to start building the bridge into other types, build forward into the other types of programs, particularly of interest to the equity space. And we're going to think about all the different programs in terms of a portfolio and what the various narratives are for each member of that portfolio to achieve the widespread, rapid, and responsible commercialization of clean technologies and mobility solutions. So I'm only going to get us part way. I'm going to be speaking from experience and familiarity and where the data exists. But we're going to constantly try to take these lessons forward into the end of the session. Let's see if I can advance this, right? Okay. So this is actually my last slide, but I wanted to bring it up first because this is where we're headed. This is what everything I'm saying is going to be in service of. Some of what I say is going to inspire evaluation efforts in other programs directly, but a lot of it will be by analogy, and you're going to have to adapt it. Which of these lessons apply to my program, which don't? How is my program or my goal or my objective different than the objective of the programs that we're talking about, but that can still benefit from similar evaluation approaches or techniques? And what are the ways you can start articulating in a data-based way the value add of different programs, both so that you can optimize their individual performance over time, but also that you can articulate their value within the portfolio and how it serves a different community in a different way. And so we're not just always constantly reducing things down to single metrics like cost effectiveness, right? We'll talk about cost effectiveness a lot, but it'll always be in the back seat to all the other equity evaluation considerations we're going to talk about today. And so you can see, these are just some of the CARB programs assembled by the team that I'll talk about in just a minute that are kind of adjacent to the programs that I'm going to be talking about. But you can see immediately there's a tremendous diversity. And even within the category of programs that I'm talking about today, there's going to be variation, and that context is going to be very specific and important. So with that, let me just go back to the beginning again and tell you real quick, my name is Brett Williams. I work for a nonprofit called the Center for Sustainable Energy. A lot of the work you see that's here really was done by the team back at CSE, including Nick and Latrice and Johns, who's here in the room as well. And so I get to play and talk and engage with you all, but I wouldn't be here without that work. And so I'm really taking advantage of their work, and I appreciate that. Okay, so let's move forward. What are we going to do? What we're going to do is we're first going to start with some conversations about equity evaluation approaches. Then we're going to talk about some of the challenges and pitfalls to doing good equity evaluation that I've seen over time, reading the research literature, doing a little bit of it ourselves, seeing others do it. And then we're going to dive in the weeds on some illustrative examples. And these examples primarily do come from statewide electric vehicle rebate programs. So in California, that's CVRP. In New York, it's called DCRP. And so not all of the lessons are going to apply directly, but hopefully the process of talking about our journey, thinking about and developing meaning and narratives from those programs will inspire something in terms of data collection, which we'll talk about later in the afternoon in a different session, about making meaning with baselines of comparison and so forth. So we're going to hit those hard for as long as I can. I'm going to talk a lot, unfortunately, about a lot of data, but hopefully there'll be enough stories mixed in to keep it interesting. And the idea is to leave at least 20 minutes at the end, so that's where you need to take those questions you saw at the very beginning and start thinking about them as we go along the way. And we're going to try to extend that bridge further into the programs and the challenges and the more core equity needs that you all represent in this room. And so you'll help me translate these lessons into lessons that we can implement for your programs as well. Okay, so with that, let's dive in. Equity approaches. There's a lot of ways to do good equity evaluation. Here's just some of them. Usually they tend to start with, okay, we have a program or we have a challenge. Let's measure just its outputs in evaluation terms. Who's receiving a rebate? What's receiving a rebate? Who's benefiting from the program? And then we tend to translate that further into behaviors affected. And then the implications of those behaviors or impacts, like greenhouse gases reduced. But just keeping a sense of what the program's doing, what it's achieving, cataloging that, and weaving stories along those metrics is very important, particularly if you do it in context. So the second point is all the examples where context actually mattered. It wasn't just a matter of, this is what the program's doing, full stop, but this is how you need to think about it, and this is why it's helpful, because it'll help the decision making. I'm not going to talk as much about 3, 4, and 5. I just want to put them as categories. 3 is really a category where we're not evaluating a program, but we're taking the data produced by a program to help us develop strategies that drive it forward. So for example, if we have a program that's rebating all Californians, we can look at the Californians who happen to be living in DACs or happen to be in income-qualified households and say, okay, what's going on there? How is it different from the overall adoption? Can we use those differences to amplify it, to reinforce what's already happening, to meet equity where it is and make it bigger and a more prominent piece of the puzzle? There's lots of goals we can do using that, and we can talk about that more in the Q&A. And then again, I'm not going to talk about cost effectiveness up front because I think it's a little bit controversial in the equity space, because if you just took all programs and you threw them in a single bucket and you threw a cost effectiveness metric on it, it'd be very difficult for those highly concierged, high labor, high touch programs to compete, because those are the ones that are going to have high costs per person served. But of course, they're essential in the portfolio, and the reason is they're accessing populations that aren't accessed by the other programs. So you have to clearly articulate the population being served, and only among comparable programs do you really compare the cost effectiveness. Nevertheless, it's an important piece of information to have, and the more we can quantify things, the better. It's unfortunate, but the more we can monetize the quantified things, the better. But we always need to think of those metrics in what we call a multi-criteria analysis. So this is important information given the population that's being served by this program and given its unique features and its costs and benefits, not just in isolation. So that's going to be a little bit back in the back seat, but it's of course there, and a lot of states and programs struggle with meeting a threshold or something like that as well. So we can get into that. So again, this is just where we're drawing from. Even one category of programs can look very different across states or across different contexts. So we've got California in blue, we've got New York in gold, we've got Massachusetts, Connecticut, Oregon, and New Jersey. And these are just some of the programs that we help states wrangle data for and make meaning from and design and administer. You don't have to digest a lot of this text on these slides, don't worry about it. It's just to give you a sense that even one category of program is going to have its own unique context and, importantly, its own set of goals. And sometimes those goals are clearly stated, and sometimes, as we heard early in the morning, there's a program that's just kind of expected to meet lots of goals, and it struggles because it's not clear how and which ones we're just hoping are side benefits and that sort of. So don't worry about this. You'll have all these slides, and there's lots of text on them. So often you can just, this is another one you can ignore, but I just wanted to put it up front, which is to say, A lot of this is what I'm going to say is already online. You can just click, download, and engage with it. You can email me or my colleagues and say, what should I be looking at? I'm really interested in doing this aspect of evaluating our program. Do you have any examples? And we can say, hey, look at slide 13 on this thing. The point is these are all free. They're not like consulting reports. You don't have to pay for them. They're all online. There's publications. There's presentations. If you're not sick of hearing me talk by the end of today, there's videos with a little bit more talk. There's dashboards. There's infographics. There's stuff like that. All of those are available. And if I put them at the end of the talk, sometimes we forget to say, hey, go check it out. All right, so let's get into the context. First are some just observations about how this work is hard, right? And we wrote up some of that in a Journal of Transport Policy to say, hey, these two worlds of equity evaluation and EVs only kind of recently collided, and the sort of integration and collision that's going on has led to challenges. And so we tried to talk about a few of those to help folks think about their way through. One of them is that a lot of traditional equity evaluation comes from a world where there's a centralized decision making, right? So this facility gets the money and this one doesn't, and the implications come up from that. And in transportation incentives, we do, even if they're not hand raiser or first come, first serve programs, they do tend to be hand raiser programs, right? It's a distributed consumer grabbing and claiming that incentive if they can figure their way through the application process and all that, right? It's not somebody deciding where the money goes. It's making the money available and creating the rules that hopefully, encourage the money to go in the right direction. And the equity evaluations do need to accommodate those differences between sort of traditional facility centralized thinking versus demand-based and more distributed systems. Another thing is that, we're often starved for data, right? And so we come up with a conclusion. Sometimes it's from an early market. In the EVs, we saw this a lot. And then the market changed radically. Or things acting on the market change it radically. COVID, supply side crunches in 2022 that raised prices, and of course, what's ahead. The other thing is even really good evaluations tend to assume you know what I know, and so you'll say like high income or low income, but we don't really know, it's not clearly defined, and why is it considered high or why is it low? It depends on the program and the program context. And the way to help create meaning from data, which then turn into those stories, which then turn into good equity evaluation, is providing that baseline of comparison, that normalized result. And we'll talk a lot about that today as we go along. And then last but not least, there's a tendency from researchers, who get trained to sort of become the best at what they do, and they alone know that space, to sort of create authoritative, complex answers that tell a community what to do. And that's often really what's not needed, right? It's more an issue of empowering and calibrating conversations so there's more self-determinism in the community. They can say, hey, I'm interested in A and C, but I'm not really as interested in B. How should I think about this? If I am interested in B, then how does that change things? It's not just tell me what to do, right? And it's often difficult for the two worlds to speak because on the one hand, if it's a good researcher and you trust them, then it's probably good advice. On the other hand, what can we do to make the results of even complex analyses more useful to the communities so that they're starting from a calibrated point of view and empowering that conversation to move forward? Okay, so these are some of the solutions. I've kind of already hinted at them. One of them is this idea that framing is important and terminology, and I just came across this today, and it's a great quote. I'm trying to learn a little bit of Hawaiian, olelo Hawaii. I'm terrible at it, but I'm going to try it. Nothing ventured, nothing, you got to risk it, right? Expose yourself to embarrassment. So it's ika olelo no ke ola, ika olelo no ke make. Life is in speech, death is in speech. Thank you. So another way to say that is words can heal and words can harm. And that's very important in the equity space too. It's not just the framing for the equity evaluation. I'll make mistakes in the course of the next 40 minutes, right? And hopefully you'll point them out, and that's a good thing, and that's how we learn. The census data I'll talk about, I'll criticize it a little bit, but sometimes it leads, sometimes it follows. It's all about this conversation, but we do need to pay attention to words, and they are important. Okay, another thing is just going to the effort of creating those baselines. That's also costly from a data perspective. It's also costly from a labor perspective, but it is what provides the meaning to a lot of the data. And last but not least, what are just the tips and tricks, data visualization, data communication that we can use that really set up a conversation, empower it, as opposed to telling it what to do. And then last but not least, I hinted already, this wasn't in the paper, but the idea that you do want to develop traditional metrics like cost effectiveness metrics. Those do help you understand the program and how to make it better, but we need to put those in context and treat them as one piece of the puzzle. Otherwise, a lot of these programs will just get pushed to the side. Okay, so now we're going to go deep, and this is where we get to play with the data, and I'm going to tell stories based on data I understand, and you're going to help me turn those lessons into things that apply or don't apply to your programs. So we're going to start with geographic equity, and I'm intentionally going to start and end with work that's not my own. It's from 3 researchers. They happen to be women and non-binary people that have done great work out there, and I want to feature them at the beginning and at the end because I've been given this opportunity, but their work is going to be just as informative of, even though they're not here, of the lessons that I'm trying to convey. So this first work was done by a group of researchers at UC Berkeley, and they kind of represent a whole suite of papers that I've read that look at geographic equity, right? And that's kind of a little bit more the talk these days and a little bit more the talk in rooms like this than it was, as we heard this morning, in the early days of a lot of these programs. And so it's really refreshing to read a lot of these papers because what they do is they try to sort through on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis how things are working out and filtering down to the ground truth that these neighborhoods are experiencing. So they take things like electric vehicles and say that improves the emissions. They take things like power plant emissions and they say a lot of disadvantaged communities are located near power plants, and so that kind of makes things worse. They take some emissions are cleaning up in the tailpipe, but others like road dust and tire wear are not over time, and what does that mean for particulate matter and that sort of thing. And they try to sort all those things out and say, what does that mean in these communities? So here we have a graph that lines up all those communities using the CalEnviroScreen score. Maybe some of you know it very well. It basically is a measure of socio and economic vulnerability and pollution exposure, all kinds of measures all distilled down into a single score, which is a whole endeavor in of itself. The less disadvantaged communities are on the left, the more disadvantaged communities are on the right, and indeed if you get one of the top 25 scores, you're officially considered in California a disadvantaged community or DAC or DAC. And you can see the pattern isn't what you would want from an equity point of view. And the shape of this is what sort of produces a lot of the more complex and rich and interesting results from this paper. You can see there's relatively more rebates per neighborhood on the left, the less disadvantaged communities, and there's relatively fewer rebates on the right in the pink zone, the more disadvantaged communities. And as a result of that, they point out, of course, the potential for emissions reduction, which is how far you go below the pink line from where you start, is greater on the left because there's more EVs there, and it's lesser and tighter, less downside but upside potential on the right where there's fewer EVs. And just understanding, even if a program is doing its best, even if it's doing its share, all of these competing factors may mean the ground truth is not adequately changing in these neighborhoods. So that was really sort of the insight that we got from it. But then we saw this one statement, and it was a causal statement. It's always a little bit tricky to have a causal statement. You kind of go out over your skis and maybe risk a little too much. But they said, as a result of the program, the emissions reductions are less in some neighborhoods than others. And we thought, okay, maybe we have something to contribute to this conversation. So the first thing we did is we just reproduced their graph on the left. And here it is using our own data from the program, and it's the same shape, right? So these are all the rebated EVs in California lined up in the same way, and it's got that same downward slope. You'd prefer that that slope would be flat, or maybe even sloping up, so there's more EVs in disadvantaged communities than there are in less disadvantaged communities. But it's not. Maybe if you're an automaker, that's not unexpected at all because you know about the structure of car buying, and we'll get to that in a minute. But is it good, is it bad? We don't know. But we were able to reproduce it, and it's not ideal, right? It's not the goal. But we added the rest of the electric vehicle market into the picture. So the green is the rebated vehicles. The orange are all electric vehicles. And you can see the market as a whole was even worse. So you had this interesting case. The program was not causing this. The program was actually helping pull the orange line down. But it was just doing it in an imperfect way, right? If it were flat or upward facing, it would be pulling it down even harder. And so that calibration of the conversation then says, okay, that's where we're at. It's not causing harm, it's just imperfectly helping. Then what do we do with that? And then you can take that as a decision maker wherever you want to take it. You can say within this program, if geographic equity becomes #1 priority, it was not for this program at the time. We're looking back and saying, what implications for geographic equity did it have? But if that was a priority, you could say, okay, let's go full court press. All the outreach related to this program is just going to be in disadvantaged communities. We're going to shift that line. Or we could say, listen, this program is not the portfolio member that's aimed at geographic equity. We need more programs to help go after geographic equity. So there's a dozen ways we can go after this, but this helps us understand, and I'm going to steal Abraham Lincoln's quote and co-opt it for equity evaluation over and over again. If we can first know where we are and whither we are tending, we can then better judge what to do and how to do it. And that's what this is all about. And the other thing is that things do change. So the researchers did a great job. We matched, and there are folks in the room that did this and allowed me to speak about it, but we matched up the time frame of that paper, and that's what it looked like. When we did the most recent year of the program before it got turned off, this is what it looked like. And so this is a much better shape. And in fact, at the far left, you can actually see it does slope up a little bit. We're kind of shifting the rebates toward the middle. Unfortunately, it's still got a little bit of a slide off on the right. But it's definitely, you know, at first glance, first order, that's the kind of shape you'd want to see. And then you want to slowly work it towards being upward slope. So things do change, and that's interesting because this particular program had its major event way back in 2016, 2017, when income criteria were introduced. So there was an income cap on who could participate, and people who were income qualified got more money, a kicker, right? And that happened way back in 2016, so you'd think by 2020, when the paper was written, you'd see more of that happening. But it really didn't take effect until then. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one is the program did continue to get tweaked over time. The income cap got lowered and the kicker got increased and different things happened. And there's no scientific way to do this yet that I've figured out, but that's at least half of what we're seeing here. But it's not all of it. The other things you have to start speculating. Oh, these things take time. Awareness about the kicker. How long does it take to diffuse that awareness out? Implementation is not theory, right? In theory, practice and theory are the same, but in practice, they're different. And so things changed. And so we need to constantly iterate and redo our analysis to understand, okay, what's the latest? Okay, how do we improve it next year? How do we improve it next year? And that's costly, and we need to make room for that, right? Okay, so wrap it all up. If you had to sort of say the media would summarize that entire paper, they'd probably summarize it in one number. 8% of rebates went to DACs. And that's an interesting fact. It's not big. But what does it mean? We don't really know. We just have this intuitive sense that's a small number. And it did grow over time. The second number is the whole life of the program, including the latter years. And you can see the right number is the last year of the program, which is a high number. So it improved over time, but not dramatically. There's also other perspectives, which is rebates are tailpipes. That's very important. But also there's funding. Show me the money. Who's benefiting from this? The funding picture is similar, but it actually gets better. It increases almost 2x over time. And again, none of these were criteria for the program specifically, but income was. In 2016-17, income became an explicit goal of the program through 1275 and the Charge Ahead Coalition, right? So now we're looking at income at the bottom. Look at the very bottom line, and you can see an almost 6x increase. So what the program was designed to do, you saw bigger results than what it wasn't designed to do, but you did have ancillary benefits in geographic equity. So being clear about your goals is important. It did do something. 58% of funding in the last year went to income qualified consumers. That completely transforms the program from what it was in the beginning to something different in the end, right? Okay, so we're gonna stick with income for a minute just because it's a usual suspect, right, when it comes to equity, but we are gonna broaden to other characteristics, and I do wanna leave time for everybody, right? So I'm gonna say a lot today. Hopefully throw a lot of spaghetti on the wall and one or two strands will stick for you and you'll say, that thing's interesting, I wanna follow up on that. But let's stick with income a little bit more, but let's broaden it to New York as well. We're dealing with a lot of data because these are high volume programs, so we're very just lucky to have 30,000 survey responses, And again, we're starting from the beginning, which is what is the program doing? What are its outputs? Who's benefiting from the program? And how do we characterize who's benefiting from the program? Income's a classic way to do that. So let's make it a little bit more sophisticated. We've got different layers of thinking about this, and we call this the distribution of funding for plug-in EV rebates by household income. So lower income buckets on the left, working up to high ones on the right. Straight out of the gate, we may be speaking slightly different languages, and that's why I wanted to emphasize words and how they matter. There's at least 3 definitions of distributed, and they're related and they're similar, but if you're thinking about one and not the other, we may already be, not rowing all in the same direction. Number one is just the concept of a graph. So distribution just means how are the colors spread from left to right. but that is reflective of how the money went out and who it went out to, number two. Number three is the concept of, is it a centralized distribution process, allocated in a specific intentional way, or is it a distributed end-use claiming, a hand-raiser program? Or is it even further, a first-come, first-served program where you have even those additional challenges from an equity perspective? Okay, so right out of the gate, we've got some word issues. Let's go back to the other things. Then we've got layers of complexity, right? If you keep it simple, at the top, you might pick 85% of funding went to households less than 150K. Kind of arbitrary, but reasonable. That happens all the time. People just sort of pick the story they're going to tell, and they don't necessarily tell the story. It's reasonable. If we take the next layer down, you can just look at the numbers on the top of the columns. That's the program as a whole. If you take the next layer down, you can split the program into those two pieces. Purple is the increased rebate for income qualified consumers. There's more purple on the left and more blue on the right. And so depending on the layer of complexity, you can tell more and interesting stories about what's going on here. But what does this all mean? You might say reasonably, it's good, it's more towards the left. From an equity perspective, it's good, it's more towards the left than the right. From an automaking perspective, it's probably not, right? They know most of their car consumers, especially new car consumers, are on the right, and they know incentives help those folks, even though we don't typically like to reserve money. If they're losing 20% of their sales, that's a lot less than the low income influence of the rebate, which might be 40% or 50%, but it's still a big deal to automakers. But enough for their lens today. We're talking about the equity lens. It's good that it's toward the left, and the purple is even farther towards the left, right? But what does it mean? Can we take it one step further to a more meaningful story that helps us understand what's really going on and what to do about it? So for this program, it's a new car program. For your program, it might be a used car program, it might be a bike program, it might be a non-vehicle program. So we've got to figure out what's your green graph for your program. But for this program, it's new cars. And here you can see the kind of surprising fact that only 42% of the new car market is in households with a total household income, including all the people in the household, of 100,000 or less. And we knew that's relatively, we know if you're buying new cars, you have more income generally, but maybe we didn't know it was quite like that. And we've got to challenge ourselves to understand the market dynamics that the programs operate in. Is it the bike market? We need to understand how bike market works. If it's used vehicles, we need to understand how used vehicle works. So then we can compare that to the program as a whole. So 42% is in the market, 62% of the program. That's better from an equity perspective, right? If the program was doing its share to help EVs go mainstream, the purple columns, or they look blue on the screen here today. Sorry, John. John loves purple. The blue-purple columns would be equal to the green columns. That would be making EVs go mainstream. Going beyond the mainstream to achieve true equity is when the blue columns or purple columns are taller than the green columns. And so we can see to what extent that's happening, and it's happening more in the middle, the second than the first, and we can start constructing those stories. And I was going to leave it there, but I actually want to take it a little bit further. This won't apply to your program specifically, but just to help you understand, what this means. Percentages are kind of abstract concepts. How do we bring it home? For this program in its final year, that 61% of funding is $175 million going to income qualified consumers or consumers less than 100,000 households. They happen to coincidentally be the same number. So if we looked at the increased rebate recipients or this percent under 100%, they're roughly the same. So for the purpose of the talk today, we can say, so this program has managed to put that much money in a priority population hands, right? The priority population consumers claimed it and it got there. The better news is the 18% of the program, which is the purple column above the green column. That's $50 million that went to pure equity goodness. So those dollars are helping not just get EVs mainstream, they're breaking down structural inequities in new car buying. And we're going to talk about the differences in decomposing the equities into those two pieces, because you're going to address structural inequities in car buying that have built up over decades in slightly different ways than you might do something that's specific to EVs. Maybe it's financing, maybe it's, it's all the different strategies, maybe targeting this problem versus that problem. And so at a minimum, it's good, again, to understand where we are and whither we are tending. Okay, and this is the whither we are tending. Don't worry about it too much. The story here is just year after year, the columns on the left got bigger and the columns on the right got smaller. That's good. Except 2022, you can't see it, but prices got so high we had that kind of hitch in the giddy up. So we went backwards and we're like, oh no, but then it continued on its way. Unfortunately, tariffs are going to give us another hitch. Let's just admit it, right? political reasons aside, chaos is not a strategy, right? This is going to go in the other direction. That's my prediction, right? So we need to understand both whither it was tending, but sort of also if we expect that trend to continue. And that's always the harder business, is the prediction. You know, nobody can predict the future. They can't give you a date and a time, but they can give you one or the other, that sort of thing. So let's go back, and now let's broaden the conversation to lots more characteristics before I wrap up and turn it over to you guys. I'm actually going to talk about the two other researchers that did some similar work, just so you know about it before I stop too. But so we're going to do all of this at once, we're going to focus on one specific question, which may not be your question, but it's an important question. Is program X disproportionately benefiting the majority? If it's not, then it doesn't tell us how to go further in optimizing the equity. But if it is, it gives us a sense, oh, there's a red flag. What do we need to do? Further, we can measure the road ahead. We can give quantitative metrics of where it's doing well, where it's not doing well. Say, oh, it's got a long road ahead on this metric, but not on that one. And that's what we're trying to do here. So the first thing to do if you were to do this for your program is, who is the majority market in your market? You know, bikes or used cars or new cars in this case. Well, it's not a surprise. These are the majority characteristics of most new car buyers. The one, again, that's more surprising is that over half the new car market is over $100,000 household income. But we know that. I'll put specific percentages on this in a minute, but first let's start with where we are with the program today in its most recent year. And you can see in some cases the percentages are large and some are small, and we might have this kind of gut reaction to whether that's good or bad, but what does it mean? And that's where we think about where we are, where we want to go to mainstream EVs, and then where we want to go beyond mainstreaming to true equitable access. So this is the mainstream market. If EVs were truly mainstream, the purple percentages would look like the green percentages. And you can see that's the case in some cases more than others. Where it's red, it would be a big difference, a long road ahead before we really went mainstream with EVs. Where it's yellow, we've got a moderate road ahead. Where it's green, we're already providing some true equity goodness. And you can see gender identification is at the top of this chart. The longest road ahead for this program was in gender identification, and home ownership tends to be up there. We'll talk about that as well. But this program actually, by the time it got turned off, was doing some good in terms of the other characteristics. Now, that means EVs are going mainstream in some ways more than others. The program is making progress in some ways more than others. Let's go ahead and take a look at New York. So this is the exact same chart with New York. Unfortunately, it's upside down. So instead of going from red to yellow to green, it goes from green to yellow to red. But other than that, it's the same type of concept. But you can see it's a very different story. Number one, they've got a longer road ahead on some variables, which is why it's red. And they're different because the program is designed in a very different way, right? They do not have income criteria. The focus was different. The set of goals was different. They do have an MSRP cap, but at the moment it's soft. So even if you buy an expensive car, you get a small rebate. If you buy a less expensive car, you get a big rebate. So it's going to look different. But nevertheless, unfortunately, gender identification is also in the mix of being the long road ahead. So that's truly identifying across states, across years, across time, all things. But depending on your context, income may be a long road ahead like it is in New York, or less of a long road ahead like it is in California, where that was explicitly addressed head on with a lot of cost and complexity, right? We were very intrusive. We went after IRS statements. We did all those things that really sort of make you say, is it all worth it? Well, it did pay off in terms of these metrics, right? Last thing on the left here now is that subset of the program, which is just the increased rebate for income qualified consumers. So this is that part of the program where, if you think of it as a program in and of itself, is actually already beyond the mainstream in all ways except for gender identification. So there's even more green on the board when you look at just those folks who income qualified. And you can think of that as, you know, going beyond the mainstream. Now, the last point I'll make is I hinted at the structural inequities in car buying versus those things that were unique to clean mobility, in this case, new EVs. And so a lot of bloggers and media and researchers use census data. It's freely available. It's something, you know, all our programs should be thinking about, and it should be, you know, congratulated. They're creating a baseline of comparison. They're trying to give the data meaning by comparing it to the population as a whole. But for this specific program, look at how different the gray numbers are from the green numbers. And that's where some of that misunderstanding comes. If I said, hey, there's a gender disparity in this program, 63 is very different than 50, I'd actually be telling two stories without realizing it. 62% of my story would be the difference between the gray and the green. That would be about structural inequities in new car buying that have built up over decades. 38% of the story I'm telling is unique to EVs and rebates. And maybe that doesn't matter depending on what you're talking about, but maybe it matters if you're developing strategies to get rid of both of those two different types of inequities, maybe financing versus incentives versus outreach and concierge support and all those sorts of things. Okay, New York, same story. I'm going to spare you the details. It's in the deck, but you can see the rows are a little bit different. Income has this kind of 30-70 split, so forth and so on. This will leave more time. We can always go back to these slides if the conversation lulls, but I have a feeling and a hope and a challenge that this conversation will not lull. You guys will not let me down. Okay, the last thing is this concept of making it accessible to decision making, right? So I've thrown a lot of complex stuff at you, a lot of data. Can we make it even better for the calibrating the conversation and empowering the conversation? So these are hypothetical dashboards, but it's basically just taking those slides and saying, what could we do? Could we give people a choice of rows? So if they're really focused on gender identification and income, they can choose those. Maybe they want urban versus rural and tribal, and we put that row and we give them that choice, and we let them choose the years, maybe even let them choose the states if it's a multi-state effort. And then we can start answering those three questions. The first question is, how long is the road ahead? Are we there, or we got a ways to go? The second question is, when there is a road ahead, how much of that is due to structural inequities and how much of that is specific to EVs? And then the last one, which I skipped over, is just progress over time. Are we there? Are we not there, but at least we're pointing in the right direction? Or have we had setbacks? And where are those setbacks? And what does that mean year to year? And so maybe something like this could inform. We could tailor it to your program, to your, and this is my 10-minute warning to stop talking. So tailor to your program based on your market, bikes or used EVs or non-vehicle programs, and come up with ways to, again, calibrate the conversation each time so that the decisions can be made. And if you're a data geek and you want to poke on income, you get the income distribution on the left. Or if you're interested in racial breakdown, you select racial breakdown and it provides it for you on the right, something like that. So this idea that we can empower the conversations not through just these sort of academic talks that I'm giving right now, but maybe through program dashboards that are standardized that we can say, okay, how's that one doing? Where is it doing? Okay, we've got a long road to go there. Let's talk about that specifically today. Okay, I talked about this. I'm going to skip it. We looked at DACs specifically in New York. We identified several lessons that spoke to both meeting equity where it was, reinforcing adoption in DACs in New York, and also acknowledging where folks just weren't even in the data, right? They were stuck behind barrier upon barrier upon barrier upon barrier. Where's the good person that taught me? That's the role of the portfolio, right? So we're going to talk about additional examples, but before I do that, I just want to say, we've been talking about a high volume, low cost program on the one hand. A subset of that program is the increased rebate for income qualified consumers. That's actually providing the same, if not better, benefits, but even that subset of the program probably has higher associated costs, right? It costs more money to income verify. It costs more money to do outreach because if you're doing it well, you're going to be sending money out to CBOs who know how to do it best. It costs more money to have multilingual support, all those sorts of things. So creating your own story is first categorizing all those services you're providing so when your costs look high, they actually aren't high because look at what you're getting. Are you also getting, data analysis? Are you also getting outreach to dealers? Are you also getting all of these different things? If you take it one step further, you've got programs who do like concierge, multi-touch to people, multi-hours spent per applicant. They're also serving a different community that isn't in this program because it takes hours and hours of support. Maybe they're also documenting cases of dealership prejudice where people are walking in the door and things are not right. And maybe there's a service that we can start telling those stories over and over. So I've started the story with this high volume program, maybe like $200 per rebate, you get all of these services, but we get to spread it over all those volumes. Then there's something in the middle, and then there's something where the number of people served is low, but they're unique in the community that's being served. They're unique in the services that they're getting. And how do we tell that story? How do we assign numbers to it if we can? How do we condense those numbers? And then how do we provide context for those numbers? Okay, so the last thing I want to do is shout out these two researchers. Actually, looks like we lost the graph on this one, so I'll just go straight to this. This is UC Davis. You may have seen Kelly give a presentation on this on a webinar. But they went and talked to communities, and they said, how would this change your opinion of EVs? And they tried to measure that. And I won't steal their thunder, but long story short, there were some clear signals, like, yes, money helps, financial incentives help. Home charging helps, that's a clear signal. Other things, it was a more complicated story. The signal wasn't as strong, and so that's a little bit of a teaser on that one. There's also a great work at the University of Vermont, and they did an analysis not just of light duty, but of heavy duty, and not just California, but the whole US. And they said, hey, we've got all these emissions, and we're expecting a certain number of electric vehicles. What does that mean for people next to the road, disadvantaged communities overall? But what would it mean if those EVs came faster and more rapidly and accumulated at a greater rate? And what does that mean for the disadvantaged communities? So they compared kind of a baseline versus an accelerated EV scenario. And of course, as you can expect, the benefits accumulate to the disadvantaged communities. Okay, so shout out there. This is where I'm going to leave it. Before I do, again, the goal of this, whether I've succeeded or failed, let's start thinking about data as stories and stories as data. Let's think about what the goals are. Let's think about the services that you provide. Just start cataloging them. Let's put numbers to them where we can, quantify them, even monetize them where we can, come up with all these metrics. And most importantly, let's start giving those meanings. So whether that's creating a baseline of comparison or normalized or whatever it is for your market, because then that's what's going to empower those conversations and at very minimum, calibrate the conversation. And that will inform the decisions which cumulatively will lead to us to the wide, rapid, responsible commercialization of electric vehicles and other technologies that will provide those truly transformative benefits. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll turn it over to you guys. All right, am I reading it right? We technically have 25 minutes, and I don't think you want me to go back to my slides and dig deeper. But if you do, I'm happy to. So if we can start running the microphones around, I see at least one hand, and then that'll give other people time to come up with more reasons to keep me from talking.
Good morning, Jose Flores with Comité Cívico del Valle in Imperial County. Since you're with the sustainable energy, I think you guys are also involved with the implementation of chargers with Cali VIP?
Yes.
So my question is, on the upside where you saw the increase to purple the last couple years, would you have the data that shows if improved or added infrastructure is mirrored in certain communities?
So it's a great question. If those of you didn't hear, the question is about a statewide electric charging infrastructure program called Cal EVIP, which our nonprofit also helps the state administer. Unfortunately, I don't feel comfortable. I'm not an expert in that program. John, do you have a straight answer? We can certainly follow up with that. And it's relating to, are the charging stations also following the need? Is that one way to simplify? And there's more nuance to his question. And I do have a couple of thoughts, but it's not about Cal EVIP. So I want to give the room opportunity to speak about Cal EVI specifically if we can. Otherwise, we'll just have to follow up.
I have an indirect answer for you. We, through CVRP, not through Cal EVIP, did an analysis of vehicle choice, why people chose the vehicles that they did in the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project. And we did find that folks who chose Tesla, for example, tended to value access to public charging much more highly than people who chose other vehicles. So this is kind of an indirect answer to your question, but there does seem to be substantial value in access to reliable charging, which the supercharger network famously is, especially relative to all the vandalism and charger outages that we've been hearing about in the news and seeing in various places. So I think that indirect, of course. There is a great dashboard, not to toot our own horn too much here, but available for Cali VIP that describes where stations are going and prices that folks are paying for getting those stations installed. That presents some great data, but unfortunately I can't directly answer, but hopefully that provides some useful resources.
And it is my understanding, if I'm not mistaken, NREL is working with the California Energy Commission to establish both numbers that say what's needed, as well as progress towards those needs. And some of my observations just from it has nothing to do with Cali VIP, but just from an equity lens, as I think about that is, the problem with needs assessment, sometimes if it's based on the concept of mainstreaming, it reinforces those structural inequities, right? So even the numbers might be based on the anticipation of how many electric vehicles will be there, but that's based on income or other things that are associated with past EV adoption, which is then in turn based on, you know, the fact that there aren't as many chargers and so forth. And I'm not saying that's happening in Cali VIP at all. I'm just saying that's something we need to be vigilant about, is number one, we're not accidentally perpetuating structural inequities by pinning goals to something that is reflective of past trends as opposed to future needs and the way it should be, not the way it was. Another thing we're finding a lot from the UC Davis research is, and also other research, is the importance of home charging, right? And a lot of the federal focus was on public charging. And so there's this tendency to sort of think of charging as public charging. They're the same thing, but it's really important to understand they're different. And, you know, if you're lucky enough to have home charging, it's transformative. You just need an outlet, man. If you don't, then it gets complicated, right? And multi-unit dwellings and that sort of thing. The other thing we're learning from research, like I've mentioned, is, and this is, I think, very specific to UC Davis, whereas the other is broader, is Kelly's work and others is saying, listen, charging doesn't necessarily sell cars until people are already thinking about cars. So we think of charging both in terms of helping sell cars, but it's not a slam dunk. We have to get people considering EVs in the first place. Then they see it and they're like, oh, okay, maybe it's possible for me. And then there's the use of it. So once you have it, your behavior changes. It's like, oh, I can relax. I can trickle charge at home, or the places I go have it already due to workplace charging or something. But the use phase is very different from the sales phase. And so my bias, my work is related to sales and cars, and your question is more about, are the chargers where they're needed? And that could be a use question, or it could be to help sell and reinforce and make these solutions realistic, right? They say the workplace is sort of like the second showroom, because if your colleagues are plugging in at work, you're like, wait a minute, it's real. Just like if you see solar panels on your house in the neighborhood, you're like, oh, it's real. Maybe that might work for me, maybe not, but at least I'm gonna start thinking about it. So those have nothing to do with your question, but at least they have to do with infrastructure. And hold us to it. Like, let's find the answer for you, the direct answer.
I have an infrastructure question as well, but it maybe is not suited for this session. I really appreciate that you brought up Cal EVIP, because I think a lot of us think about electric vehicles, but we aren't always thinking about charging. And I think, Brett, you mentioned, right, it's like the purchase kind of piece of it. And we all know, I think, or maybe I'll just say it out loud and make it explicit, that like, if you don't have access to reliable home charging, owning a plug-in electric vehicle is very challenging, especially if you rent, especially if you don't have dedicated off-street parking, or you live in an apartment or in multifamily housing. So that's been like an ongoing industry problem that I think most of us recognize. And I'm just curious, with these program dashboards, like, this is really great data. I'm wondering how we can, I guess, further unpack the chicken or egg problem around, if you build it, they will come, or we know where people now have vehicles registered through CVRP data, for example. Are we seeing the same uptake of charging or charging stations infrastructure being deployed in those areas to serve those people? Granted, we don't know where all these people are driving to, right? It could be anywhere, but because the Tesla experience is so good, how can the broader community, maybe people who can't afford Teslas or don't want a Tesla, for whatever reason, how do we enable people to adopt EVs by also ensuring that the infrastructure is there so they can, you know, reliably fuel their car to get to work, school, whatever? Maybe that's just a question to the general public. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure, please.
It's more of a comment. So I'm in the market for purchasing a car, and because of new developments, I'm debating if I want to get a Tesla or not. But the Tesla charging infrastructure is accessible for other electric vehicles. So I think that makes, I think that information needs to be put out there more so readily available, that there are still opportunities for people to purchase EVs and have some form of reliable infrastructure. The problem then comes, like somebody mentioned earlier, Tesla software basically tells you where the charges are and if they work, et cetera. The other ones like Electrify America or ChargePoint, et cetera, their network or consistency for what is readily available and that works is not as strong as the software that's available for Tesla. So.
Hello, thank you. I have actually a question, if I may ask, from the follow-up of the data which you shared. Is that okay?
Yeah. By nature, we're going to jump around a little bit, so let's hold ourselves to follow-up and conversations and asking specific goal questions like, okay, what can we do to address that question? But please, go ahead.
Yeah, so my question is, like, having seen the data, there are some blind spots which I could identify in this. Maybe you already have covered it, maybe it's not presented. For example, an average household, which I've consumed about 20 to 30 kilowatt hour per day for energy. And if you own an electric car, that actually doubles or triples it. And secondly, the question is like how we are going to manage that doubling or tripling of energy in a sustainable manner, which does not like offset just the supply chain emissions, but actually like it's more like in a manner which is more sustainable. So that question is always up, like, because the way we are living and the way we are commuting, actually it boils down to that, our lifestyle. And so secondly, like I had a question because I owned EVs for some time, and what I realized is that the cars are much more heavier, about 20 to 30% heavier than the normal cars, which actually could cause more problematic while driving, especially the tire wear and loss is way like almost double. And all those particles from the tire is actually going into the environment. So I don't know if you have accounted for that data somewhere, because ultimately it's coming down into our respiratory systems, which we cannot even see. So it's more like a holistic picture of like EV transition, or is it like a multimodal transition where we actually have mass transit, which is an energy efficient system, and also like collaborated with much more effectively with multimodal, so that we can commute much more efficiently and have like more walkable neighborhoods. So it all boils down to that design. I don't know if somebody's paying attention to that, but is there some data which is presentable about that?
Yeah, I think you've touched on a lot of good points, and I'll let people shout out the resources that they know about as well. But one point is, we are shifting emissions to the grid. The good thing about California is the grid's getting cleaner over time, right? We're in a good spot. That's catching everything and making it better. And in fact, that's one reason why we think of traditional electric load as bad and energy efficiency is good, but we think of electric vehicle load as good because you're shifting from gasoline combustion there. It also makes me think about utility bills, right? At some point, gasoline or electric fuel is cheaper and the operating costs are lower, and that's great for equity. But we can't just shift costs from purchase to those sorts of things. But at some point, you actually are going to bump yourself up into a tier where your electricity is slightly more expensive and it starts getting more complicated and all these things. So that's a nuance. Last but not least, I will say the very first article that I talked about, that UC Berkeley study, they were one among many that are highlighting the issue of the road particulate matter and the brake emissions. And it's both a problem in and of itself, but it becomes an increasing problem in the electric vehicle future, not just because electric vehicles are heavy and increase some of those emissions, but because the other emissions are going down, and so those are the emissions that are left, and the balance of the smog forming and the particulates going in the lungs and everything becomes the critical picture as you move farther into this electrified future. So the good news is a lot of researchers are starting to highlight those issues. Of course, system thinking is always great, and cars may not be the equity priority for your organization, right? It may be transit. Of course, we know we can't get away from cars, right? They are such a huge piece of the puzzle, so we can't ignore it. That's why I've tried to emphasize both optimizing a given program, but thinking about the portfolio. And you're saying the portfolio has to include non-car things as well. I tend to think in my world of which car things are in the portfolio, concierge, helping different communities, financing helping different communities, and then incentives, money helping essentially all communities, because the affordability work that John did and others says, to be quite honest, you can optimize an incentive for cost effectiveness and it's going to be smaller, but if you want to give true choice in the market in an equitable way, the affordability-based incentives are huge. They're bigger than we're providing. With most states don't have the appetite or the budgets to afford it. But that is always an important reminder. The reason Norway has 90% EVs is because they threw everything at it. So cumulatively, it was huge incentives for a long time. And so we think, oh, we're the US. It's all great. It's much farther. It's happening in China. It's happening in the US. It doesn't matter if we are no longer competitive in this space, right? They're throwing big incentives and they're clear, consistent signals. The goal here is how do we harness that for equity? And maybe we don't have quite as much money at our resources yet, but how do we sort of do that? So sorry, I co-opted John's affordability analysis, basically just to say the needed incentives, especially for equity, are probably much bigger than you think. So emissions, yes. There are a couple other things there, but the portfolio, expanding that beyond cars, absolutely. That's part of the bridge we're trying to build out from the core of this presentation. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, Susana Medina here, Grid Alternatives, Access Clean California. In my experience helping folks with the application process is just a comment along the lines of infrastructure. A lot of them get a little nervous when they don't know the types of EVs available because they think it's only electric, right? Full battery. So when they understand they can get a plug-in hybrid, they're like, okay, I have that alternative, because then they get nervous about where am I going to charge it? If I'm not, if I'm not in a single-family home, maybe I can't get a charger. So just along the lines of infrastructure. Now, when we explain to them a little bit about fuel cell, they don't have a lot of good things to say. But I just wanted to comment along the lines of infrastructure.
Yeah, hey, since I'm going to guess 2015, I've been calling plug-in hybrids the gateway drug to full electric driving. So for some communities and for a long time in the data in California, if you looked at priority population adoption, it disproportionately favored plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. And there's reasons for that. Charging deserts, confidence. Maybe they're thinking about it more in terms of this gets better gas mileage versus this is a transformative technology, that sort of thing. In the most recent data, that has changed a little bit. We've kind of seen this flip to the plug-in hybrids being a little bit more of those premium products that have the smaller batteries and are performance tuned and stuff. So it's complicated, but back in the day, and I would say in general, we cannot ignore, if we're trying to get to 100%, we're off and running with all electric now. We weren't originally, but now we are. But there's that last 20 to 40% of resistors that may not do it at all, or they may need these gateway drugs. Again, they may make a comeback. They may need choices. The other thing you're talking about is just outreach best practices, right? How do you communicate this stuff? How do you communicate in a way that it's accessible? I've seen research that says the proclivity or desire to adopt an EV is just as high everywhere. Our own research in New York, the proclivity is high, but they're stuck behind barriers. And often what that results is, I want an EV, but I'm not considering it as my next EV. And that's going to be more common in disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, than overall. And it's actually, they may want the environmental benefits more. They may be more motivated to adopt an EV, but it's not the realistic next choice. So what is the outreach best practice that makes it the realistic next choice? And answer it, if you have resources or best practices, share them.
I'm going to contribute a little to the jumping around here. I wanted to return and offer a thought that connects Candace's and Isaac's points about the importance of reliable charging for folks that don't have it at home, to the points you were making about storytelling around the data that we're collecting in these projects. I think reputation really matters in the public charging space. We saw it in the analysis that I talked about earlier with Tesla having this really good reputation for supercharger network. If the public views other networks as less reliable, that's a hard hole to dig out of, right? So what we can do is monitor how that's going over time by collecting data about people's experiences with these charging networks and then tell stories about how things are improving, if they are. I know there's a lot of work going into this already and increasingly so over time. So if we can capture that through something like perhaps a survey around the charge card programs that several programs are implementing, or other ways of assessing how reliable these stations are in the market, then we can increase confidence in these other networks and provide people with more options and choices around charging outside of the home. So 2 thoughts there.
And just to reinforce, I know CEC and former Commissioner Monahan, Patty, they were very laser focused on reliability of stations. That was brought up earlier in the day. And so I know that's a very important piece to that infrastructure conversation for sure. And in my home state as well. The stations, there's kind of a joke. Either you've got someone charging a Tesla sitting in their car working on their computer, or the station doesn't work, you know? And so how do we sort of put that into a reliable situation where you go to the grocery store? And to be honest, I found it even myself. I tend to stay a little bit longer, buy a little bit more, because it's like, oh, I'll just get a couple more miles out of it, you know? But it's gotta be reliable, and if it's not, then of course you're not gonna consider it for your next car, right? That's a reinforcing negative cycle as opposed to the positive cycle that we want. And another observation we have is, you know, disadvantaged communities are gonna have different outreach strategies. So we can harness this data to tailor it to what's working. In New York, environment was actually even stronger in disadvantaged communities, probably because it's front and center. Energy security was lower. That used to sell a lot of EVs back in the day, energy security. Well, they're like, that's abstract. I need clean lungs, I need access to low operating costs, you know, stuff like that. So we can use these data to say what's working and resonate the outreach. We can design the programs and carve out, say you have a budget and you'd like to include everybody, you can systematically line up the free riders and say, let's carve them out first, let's carve them out next, and we'll just meet our budget or our threshold for GHG reductions or whatever. We're now getting much better at doing that.
Hi, my name is Ava. I'm part of a fellowship program with Grid Alternatives. Specifically, I assist with program administration for San Diego's Clean Cars for All program. And when I first joined, I have a computer science background, so I really looked into what decided the thresholds of eligibility, so the CalEnviro screen, the DAC census tracts. And of course, when you were doing this initial research and deciding these thresholds, there are outlying communities. For San Diego specifically, one of the outlying communities that we've identified are people that live in affordable housing communities that may not necessarily fall within these overall disadvantaged communities. So when it comes to actual community outreach, people may not be eligible for the max incentive amount, but they themselves are a disadvantaged person. I guess my question is, how exactly do you go about humanizing the data and explaining to community members why they may not exactly fit the exact threshold of eligibility for specific programs despite themselves being disadvantaged?
So I'm gonna hope some outreach people will weigh in, but I'm gonna reinforce what she's saying by saying, you know, there's geographic equity, but in DACs, you've got, essentially we found in New York, you've got two types of adoption going on. You've got one type of adoption, which looks like a lot like every other adopters. In other words, they're the higher income folks who happen to be in DACs, mirroring the overall EV trends. And then you've got these more disruptive signals in the data happening where it's, oh, those are probably lower income folks who were previously stuck behind barriers who found their way into the program. And then you've got people who don't even show up in the data. And so they don't show up in the data, they don't show up in the eligibility criteria. How do you figure that part out is my world, and then how do you outreach and message that? That's your question, and I would defer to the outreach experts. And we have some throughout the day, and Lori Walker here is one, and people who've worked with people on the ground in various communities or others, and that's who I've learned a lot from as well. So can anybody help answer that question? Like, if somebody is facing a true barrier or barrier upon barrier upon barrier, but somehow they're left out of the program, what do we do about it? First thing I say is we've got to track so we know who's being left out and improve the design over time. That's the point of this evaluation. But oh, you've stumped the room.
You're making me run too fast.
No, I'm sure they can hear me. I'm pretty loud anyway.
The online people.
Oh, got it. Sorry, thanks. Yeah, no, so we're in the Replace Your Ride program, which is Clean Cars for All for the South Coast Basin. And so we usually, when we run into that with the census tract, like you said, like you mentioned, for us, we tell them you do qualify for the program still because, based on income and everything else, the car you're going to scrap. But you just, the census tract, what it does is it takes away that plus up incentive, which is the $2,000. So they still qualify for the, the $10,000 for an EV, but just not the extra $2,000. And unfortunately, that's just the way the program's designed, and that's the, if one is the cutoff on how we're just administrators of the program essentially. But and also usually when I do that conversation with them and break the news to them, we also bring up other incentives. Like I tell them, oh, if you live in if you're utility Southern California Edison, they offer up to $4,000, and there's other types of incentives in different areas, and that they can potentially take advantage of to basically make that up a little bit. So that's how we've addressed it. Sure.
And it's always a mess, right? You're always going to have free riders, and you're always going to have people left out, and you just got to keep pounding on those program design and outreach messaging. So either you've got it right, or at least you're focusing in the right direction. And so a lot of it's aimed at minimizing those mistakes.
Hi, Taylor Sieben here. Oops, sorry, that's loud. From Access Clean California. We've sort of seen from some of your information about CVRP, and we heard from Lisa this morning that often the approach of CARB and other agencies, similar with CEC and the Cali VIP program, is to sort of start with like a rapid deployment mass market program and then move into equity programs sort of after the fact. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if there's been any analysis on if the data actually confirms that assumption that those mass market programs are necessary, or if there's any evidence that it doesn't work to just start with an equity program and see, if we can start there and really put those dollars into those higher incentive amounts, sort of what you were talking about with affordability being an issue. I'm just curious if there's been any sort of data analysis on that piece, because I think most of our state agencies operate under that same model and that same assumption. And I'm curious if we really should be, and if that assumption has really been confirmed anywhere.
Yeah, I won't speak on behalf of the agencies, but as always, I have some thoughts. The first is, the answer to your question lies a lot to do with industry, right? So one of the points of my talk is understand the market dynamics on which your program is acting. At the end of the day, a program that's ill-designed could have, by mistake, greater equity benefits than a program that is 100% equity. And you need to have that portfolio approach regardless. If you talk to an automaker in the room, they're going to tell you a very different story than what I've told today. And the policymakers have to balance those perspectives, right? You've got that. What seems reasonable to the equity perspective is not going to seem reasonable to the automaker perspective, and vice versa. And there's that balancing act always, right? So the short answer is yes. If you want volume, if you want these technologies to exist, you have to have some policy structure. We heard this morning that probably starts first and foremost with supply regulations, right? If you have that underpinning, but the incentives are then what release the market. Having said that, what I have seen over the years is just my own observation, which has nothing to do with reality, but it's my own observation. There is this approach shift now where equity is now job one. And from that, job one, you can build your way out. So everybody's thinking that way where it's, okay, and this was true even in CVRP, the lights never went out on the low income increased kicker. Even through there was disruptions probably 8 out of 10 years in funding. And there was wait lists which are painful, but the money nobody ever got that qualified for that low income kicker didn't get it. So there was even some of that built in, but we heard about it's even more now, right? It's okay, how do we structurally design it so there's conscientious phase down, so when things are triggered, we're always going to be retreating it to a core. And you could call that equities job one. And I think in the evaluation frameworks, which is all I can speak to, I can't speak beyond that in terms of what's actually happening, there is that approach, which is if you cover the bases first and then build out to the extent the budget allows, that's kind of win-win, right? So you can handle job one, then do cost effectiveness, and compare what's going to get you the most bang for your buck, but within covering job one. And there is a difference between industry and public funds, right? So there's always a constant question about, okay, what supports transformation? Transformation is good for climate change, which is also good for equity. That's a very tricky, if we don't get enough clean cars on the road, equity is not going to win either, right? So there's that. But how do we start covering the bases and realize once those bases are covered, that solves that problem, but then we can keep building out as budget allows, and then that builds it into the automaker's needs. So I think I've seen, at least in the evaluation frameworks or the strategies, that approach is more built into the mindset these days. Am I wrong? Is that reality? At least in the way we're evaluating or thinking about the programs, right? And I won't speak for CARB or CEC or CPUC, but so is there evidence? We got to have a conversation with automakers. Unfortunately, you have to understand, if it's a bike incentive, we got to understand how bike markets work, right? Because we can serve communities who need it most, but we also need to make sure that the market happens, right? And the other thing is, even if you aren't casting this huge wide net, you want to make sure your program, whatever it is, works well, right? So you need to optimize your program. So without being ambitious about what's the global strategy? For a given program, we need to understand the market forces, and we can either say, I understand and I'm gonna Aikido those to my benefit, or I'm working against it because the market forces are structurally inequitable and we need to fight against it through financing or whatever. But by understanding it, then you can choose the strategy, right? You can Aikido, you can fight, you can supplement, you can say, this program's doing its share, but it's not enough. What else do we need? That's the best I got. I'm not hearing you. Okay, we've got, oh no, that's why you're quiet. We're 3 minutes over. All right, does anybody want to see us out with a final observation? And it can come out of left field, don't worry about it. Let's give voice to whoever hasn't had voice.
Juan Carlos Garcia, UC Davis. Maybe just quickly comment on the infrastructure piece. UC Davis is doing a statewide research project on evaluating the public infrastructure system, so sending out undergraduate students to test out these chargers, so that's ongoing. And maybe just a quick thing that you mentioned, maybe something that I'm teeing up for our future research is whether we are overlooking the role of dealerships. I was in the car market because I needed to purchase a new vehicle at the beginning of the year. It was an incredibly stressful situation going into these dealerships, and I'm wondering if that is something that needs to be looked at more closely, and whether or not that is the only way that vehicles need to be purchased.
Mm-hmm. It seemed like we identified dealers as a challenge at the beginning, and it seemed like we were starting to figure out how to address that challenge, and it seems like now it's coming back, it's grumbling again, and there's all these deeper, darker issues than we thought. And I don't know the answer to that, but is that true? Is that kind of the trajectory of things? Is that a looming challenge that is worthy of UC Davis study? Are people experiencing? That was my understanding from the outreach folks that I've talked about is there's rock star dealers and there's dealers that are literally making people feel unsafe or insecure about, depending on how they walk in the door and what pre-approved rebate they have, they get treated differently, right? So that's what I'm trying to echo here. And that's why I'm saying what I'm saying, but I don't know. You guys are in the field.
No, I just wanted to add also from a loan perspective, if we're providing low cost and clean, dollars to communities. I think we always assume that people are ready and they have financial literacy to purchase these vehicles, when in reality, that might be an over-assumption. And I don't believe there's enough conversation going on about the financing part. No, I just wanted to add to that as far as dealerships, but also from the lending perspective. I'm with the USC Credit Union. We have a flourishing clean energy lending department. We're the Southern California lender for DCAP as well. And we're really interested in creating non-traditional loans for our members to adopt these technologies, especially renters. And we're really interested in having these conversations and obtaining feedback and how can we create these low-cost dollars. Because with the DCAP program, it's an 8% cap, regardless of FICO score, where in the market you would be obtaining maybe a 17, 18%, and that just becomes a financial barrier and an entry point as well.
Yeah. And the other thing I'd echo is, what do we do about dealers, right? Partnership. They're not one monolithic beast that's presenting a challenge. There's also education and outreach that's working. How do we amplify what's working and hold to task what's not or what's a little bit sketchy, right? So how do we partner with CNCDA? How do we, do outreach? So that's hopefully what some of that will produce as well. So we heard about financing. Any other voices that haven't been heard or issues that we haven't been raised? I'll put we're over time ban on the infrastructure questions that I'm failing to answer, but we can definitely follow up on those. There's definitely CSC folks that'll help. Okay. Seeing nothing else, thank you so much. It really has been a privilege to be a part of this conversation. Right, you'll hear it again now more than ever. I'm so happy to be working on this, so thank you.